In the summer of 1943, as the Second World War raged across continents and oceans, a small group of captured German officers found themselves standing in stunned silence on the polished floor of an American aircraft plant in Michigan. These men, once the proud elite of the Wehrmacht, had been brought from their comfortable yet restrictive prisoner-of-war camp to witness what their captors called the arsenal of democracy. Among them stood Hauptmann Klaus Richter, a 32-year-old Luftwaffe pilot whose Messerschmitt Bf 109 had been shot down over Tunisia only months earlier. When he was told he would be allowed to tour an aircraft factory, he expected to see the usual chaos of wartime production, sweat-stained mechanics hammering, sparks flying, a handful of aircraft being assembled piece by piece. What he witnessed instead was something so vast, so precise, and so utterly alien to his understanding of warfare that it shattered the last remnants of his belief in Nazi victory. Before him stretched an endless sea of metal and motion, Detroit's Willow Run Bomber Plant, a single-purpose industrial cathedral where 42,000 workers, men and women, black and white, farmers and housewives, engineers and teenagers, moved with the rhythm of a machine that never slept. Beneath the bright electric lights, the assembly line advanced in perfect synchronization, each section dedicated to a specific stage of creation. Fuselages rolled forward on rails, wings were lowered by overhead cranes, and riveters hammered in unison to the steady pulse of production. Every 63 minutes, a fully functional B-24 Liberator heavy bomber rolled out of the hangar doors, engines roaring like thunder, ready to join the armadas flying toward Fortress Europe. Richter's first reaction was disbelief, his second, despair. No matter how many times German propaganda had told him that the American soldier was weak, undisciplined, and decadent, nothing could explain what his eyes now beheld, a country that had turned manufacturing into warfare, mathematics into might, and time itself into a weapon. As the convoy of German POWs was guided through the plant, an American officer proudly explained that this facility alone could produce more bombers in a single month than the entire Luftwaffe could replace in half a year. Richter understood the implications instantly. If one factory could do this, what about 10? What about 100? The enormity of it defied reason. Everywhere he looked, there was abundance, racks of engines, piles of aluminum sheets, conveyor belts carrying precision parts by the thousands. There were no shortages, no desperate improvisations, no sense of exhaustion or scarcity. Everything was organized, supplied, and functioning with an efficiency that felt almost inhuman. To men raised in the myth of German engineering's superiority, it was a revelation bordering on humiliation. The Americans had industrialized victory. Richter's thoughts returned to Germany, to the factories of Bremen, Hamburg, and Augsburg, where men and women worked under constant bombardment, where power shortages and material rationing turned production into agony. He remembered the makeshift repairs, the scavenged copper wire, the small triumphs of producing even a single completed aircraft under the rain of Allied bombs. And now, standing in Detroit, he realized that all of it had been in vain. The United States possessed not just more resources but a completely different philosophy of production. Here, efficiency was not about precision craftsmanship or artistic perfection, it was about volume, speed, and reliability. The Ford Motor Company, which operated Willow Run, had applied the same principles that once built millions of automobiles to the manufacturing of machines of war. It was industrial democracy at war, a collaboration between government, corporations, and ordinary citizens that dwarfed the tightly controlled, militarized system of Nazi Germany. The German war economy, though formidable in its organization, relied on forced labor, fear, and the illusion of control. America's, by contrast, thrived on participation, innovation, and the motivation of a free workforce united by purpose. Richter watched as women, some barely out of high school, guided huge pneumatic drills into the sides of bomber fuselages with practiced ease. He saw black and white workers side by side, sharing tools and space, something unthinkable in Hitler's Reich. The sight alone was a blow to everything he had been taught to believe about racial hierarchy and the supposed disunity of democratic societies. What Germany's leaders called decadence was in fact power, the power of inclusion, of mass cooperation, of a system that allowed every individual to contribute to a common goal without fear or coercion. As the group moved along the catwalks overlooking the assembly line, Richter noticed the banners hanging from the ceiling: "Every minute counts, every bomber matters, victory begins at home," and "Work safely, work quickly." Beneath those slogans, thousands of workers smiled, sweated, and shouted above the hum of the machines, their energy filling the air with an almost tangible sense of unstoppable momentum. The American officer explained that the plant ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in 3 shifts, without interruption. There were cafeterias that could feed thousands at once, medical stations, nurseries for children, and dormitories for workers who lived too far to commute. Every conceivable obstacle to production had been anticipated and eliminated. Even transportation of parts between stations was automated by conveyor belts and electric trolleys. Richter tried to imagine such a thing in Germany, where trains were increasingly reserved for troop movements and fuel was too precious for anything but tanks and aircraft. Here, fuel was abundant, rubber plentiful, steel inexhaustible. The sheer scale of it mocked the carefully rationed austerity of the Reich. America's war machine, he realized, was not sustained by conquest or plunder but by organization, coordination, and a national will to produce. When the tour ended, the POWs were escorted outside, where a row of freshly completed B-24s gleamed in the afternoon sun, each bearing the insignia of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the names chosen by their crews: Hell's Angel, Liberty Bell, Detroit Thunder. The bombers stood like metallic giants, their propellers still, their bellies capable of carrying 5 tons of explosives across oceans. Richter found himself staring at one aircraft in particular as it was towed toward the runway. Within minutes, its engines ignited, the ground shook, and it lifted gracefully into the sky, climbing toward the horizon where the haze of industrial smoke blurred into the blue. A worker nearby smiled and said, half-jokingly, "See you in Berlin." The word struck Richter like a physical blow. He knew then that this factory, this place, was producing not just machines but destiny. Each bomber was a promise that the Allies would not stop, would not falter, would not tire until the Reich lay in ruins. As the prisoners boarded the bus that would take them back to camp, silence filled the cabin. No one spoke. The rhythmic rumble of the engine matched the pounding in Richter's head. He stared out the window at the sprawling complex receding behind them, a city of metal and fire that symbolized an empire of industry. The numbers kept echoing in his mind: 1 bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That was 1,000 bombers in a month, 12,000 in a year, from one facility. He did the math instinctively, comparing it to the Luftwaffe's total production back home. The difference was not a gap. It was a chasm, an abyss that no amount of heroism or sacrifice could bridge. That night, in the quiet barracks of the POW camp, Richter and his fellow officers spoke in hushed tones. The experience had changed them. One by one, they confessed their disbelief, their quiet terror at the realization that they were fighting a war that could no longer be won. "We were told that America was soft," one of them muttered, staring into the darkness. "If this is softness, then God help us." The others nodded, unable to find words. The idea of German invincibility, a belief nurtured by years of propaganda, victories, and discipline, had begun to crumble. They had seen the true face of American power, and it was not the face of chaos or weakness, it was the face of order, precision, and limitless production. In the weeks that followed, Richter would often close his eyes and see the assembly line again, the endless motion, the gleaming metal, the sense that somewhere in that massive complex, time itself was being bent and shaped into weapons. He understood now that wars were not won solely by courage or strategy but by capacity. In the weeks that followed their visit to the Willow Run factory, Hauptmann Klaus Richter and his fellow prisoners found themselves returning not to a bleak existence of deprivation, but to an environment that defied every expectation they had of captivity. The American prisoner of war camps, spread across the vast interior of the United States, were, in almost every respect, the opposite of what the Germans had been told to expect. For men raised under the shadow of totalitarianism, it was bewildering to discover that even in war, even under the care of their enemies, humanity could flourish. Camp Concordia in Kansas, where Richter was later transferred, stretched across hundreds of acres of open plains, surrounded by barbed wire and wooden watchtowers, yet the atmosphere inside was strangely calm, almost domestic. The prisoners were assigned barracks built from sturdy timber, each equipped with heating, bunks, and electric lights. Food was served 3 times a day, and to Richter's astonishment, it was not the thin gruel of wartime Europe but a hearty, plentiful diet: meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, even fruit. The Geneva Convention rules were followed meticulously. Each prisoner received clothing, male privileges, and the right to work for small wages. It was a civilization of rules, order, and fairness, something that stood in stark contrast to the propaganda-driven narratives that had painted Americans as chaotic barbarians. The POWs had expected cruelty; what they found instead was abundance and discipline without fear. This paradox gnawed at them in ways no weapon could. Richter often walked along the inner perimeter fence during the evenings, watching the sunset spread across the Kansas sky, thinking of Germany, of the bombed-out factories of Bremen and the food shortages that haunted civilians back home. He thought of his wife, Elsa, and their 2 children, standing in long lines for bread, hiding in basements as air raid sirens wailed. He knew that while he and his fellow captives were eating well in captivity, their own families were starving under Allied blockades. The realization filled him with guilt, but it also planted the first seeds of understanding. America was not simply powerful because of its machines, it was powerful because it had built a society that could sustain itself even in total war. Everything here, from the plentiful food to the efficiency of the guards, spoke of a nation that had mastered organization without oppression. The guards were polite but firm, their authority exercised through procedure rather than intimidation. There were no beatings, no executions, no arbitrary punishments. When rules were broken, discipline was swift but fair. That fairness disturbed the prisoners more deeply than any brutality could have, because it dismantled the image of the barbaric democracy they had been taught to despise. Inside the camp, daily life followed a structured rhythm. There were roll calls, work assignments, and recreational hours. Many prisoners volunteered for agricultural labor, helping American farmers harvest wheat, cotton, or corn. For each day worked, they received tokens or small wages redeemable at the camp canteen. To men who had spent their lives under the rigid control of the Nazi war machine, the idea of earning money from their captors felt surreal. Yet as the weeks turned into months, that routine became a form of quiet rehabilitation. They began to see American prosperity up close, not as propaganda, but as lived reality. The farms they worked on were vast, mechanized, and efficient, powered by tractors and combines that dwarfed anything they had seen in Europe. Even in wartime, there were no shortages of fuel or fertilizer. Farmers greeted them cordially, often offering lemonade or sandwiches during breaks, and many spoke with pride about their sons fighting overseas. It became clear to Richter that this entire nation was mobilized, not just its soldiers or factories. Housewives rationed sugar and rubber, children collected scrap metal, farmers delivered record harvests to feed both civilians and armies. There was a collective will here that transcended fear or propaganda, a unity rooted in belief rather than coercion. At night, in the dim light of their barracks, the German prisoners debated endlessly about what they were witnessing. Among them were loyal Nazis, skeptics, idealists, and broken men. Some still clung to Hitler's promises of miracle weapons, the V-1 rockets, the Tiger tanks, the whispered, wonder weapons, that Goebbels claimed would turn the tide of war. But as the months passed and news filtered through the newspapers allowed by camp censors, hope gave way to resignation. The Allies were advancing in North Africa, in Italy, in the skies over Germany itself. Every headline told the same story: American bombers, perhaps even those from Willow Run, were now appearing over Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich in waves too vast to count. Richter could not help but imagine the faces of the workers he had seen, their coordinated movements, the endless stream of bombers rising into the sky. He knew those machines now carried destruction to his homeland. The irony was bitter: the same precision and productivity that had so impressed him were now the instruments of his nation's ruin. Yet even in that realization, there was a strange sense of awe. Germany, he realized, had gambled everything on ideology, America had gambled everything on efficiency, and efficiency was winning. The transformation among the prisoners was gradual but profound. In time, camp newspapers and education programs were introduced by American officials as part of a quiet re-education effort. The goal was not overt indoctrination but exposure to truth, to democracy, to the free exchange of ideas. In Concordia, the camp library grew to include hundreds of books, Shakespeare, Goethe, Churchill, Roosevelt, even American magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post. For many POWs, it was their first unfiltered glimpse of the world beyond Nazi censorship. Some read with curiosity, others with growing discomfort. Richter devoured history and economics, trying to understand how America had built such vast power so quickly. He learned about the New Deal, about mass production, about the cultural belief in progress and innovation that ran like a current through American life. He realized that this society, for all its imperfections, had achieved something Germany never could under dictatorship, a harmony between individual freedom and collective strength. In conversations with other prisoners, he began to speak cautiously about these ideas. "We thought control was power," he once said to a fellow officer, "but perhaps freedom is the greater strength." Meanwhile, the camp itself became a microcosm of what post-war Germany might one day become. POWs organized orchestras, theater groups, and even schools. Some built model airplanes or practiced carpentry, others painted murals or wrote essays about their experiences. The Americans encouraged it, understanding that constructive engagement was the antidote to extremism. There were even Sunday services, where captured chaplains preached sermons not about conquest but about reconciliation. The guards, many of them young men barely older than the prisoners, sometimes joined them in conversation, playing chess or sharing stories. Slowly, the walls between captor and captive began to blur. Richter observed it all with quiet fascination. In this strange, fenced-in world, he saw democracy in miniature, imperfect, yet alive. The order of the camp was maintained not through terror but through consent, and the prisoners themselves took part in maintaining discipline. It was a living example of a principle he had never encountered in the rigid hierarchy of the Reich: shared responsibility. As 1944 unfolded, the war's tide turned decisively against Germany. News of the Allied landings in Normandy reached the camp, and though it was officially censored, rumors spread quickly. By late summer, the prisoners knew that Paris had fallen. The sense of inevitability deepened. Some of the die-hard Nazis reacted with fury, threatening fellow prisoners who dared to speak against the regime. There were secret clashes at night, whispered threats, and even a few violent altercations. But the majority had already crossed an invisible line in their minds. They no longer feared defeat, they anticipated it. Richter, once a proud officer who believed in Germany's destiny, now found himself studying the structure of the American economy, sketching diagrams of assembly lines, imagining how such systems could one day rebuild a destroyed Europe. The idea that democracy could coexist with industrial might had become undeniable. America's power
was not just mechanical, it was moral. Its strength lay in its openness, its willingness to let every citizen participate. What the prisoners learned in those camps was a quiet truth that would later define post-war Germany, that the future belonged not to those who ruled through fear, but to those who built through cooperation. As months turned into years, many POWs, including Richter, came to see their captivity not as humiliation, but as education. They learned English, studied American newspapers, and followed the political debates that filled the radio airwaves. They watched a nation argue, criticize, and still function, something inconceivable under Hitler's iron grip. In those debates, Richter saw the secret of democracy's endurance: it could absorb conflict without collapsing. For him, this was the most profound revelation of all. By the time the war neared its end in 1945, the German POWs in America had undergone a transformation deeper than any physical captivity could enforce. They had witnessed abundance where they expected scarcity, fairness where they expected cruelty, and dignity where they expected domination. The myth of Aryan superiority lay in ruins, replaced by the understanding that power came not from ideology but from productivity and justice. When Klaus Richter was finally informed that Germany had surrendered, he felt neither shock nor rage, only an immense, weary clarity. The war had been lost not in the trenches or the skies, but in the factories, the farms, and the hearts of ordinary people who believed in something larger than themselves. America had shown him that a nation's true weapon was not its army, but its capacity to sustain life, to build, to feed, and to imagine a future.
By 1944, the illusion of German supremacy was collapsing under the weight of arithmetic. The war that had once seemed a triumph of will was becoming a test of numbers, and in that test, the Reich was hopelessly outmatched. The Allied bombing campaigns, now intensified by the thousands of bombers rolling off American assembly lines every month, were dismantling the very core of Germany's industrial structure. Cities like Hamburg, Essen, and Cologne were reduced to twisted skeletons of steel and rubble. Rail yards burned for days, oil refineries lay shattered, and the great Ruhr industrial basin, the beating heart of the German war economy, was bleeding out under relentless air raids. Inside the surviving factories, production had turned into a desperate act of defiance. Workers toiled among ruins, machinery was relocated underground, and engineers scavenged for parts in bombed warehouses. Yet even as German propaganda insisted that new, miracle weapons would soon change the course of the war, the truth was inescapable. The Luftwaffe was running out of fuel, the panzer divisions lacked spare parts, and the once proud industrial engine of the Reich was starving itself to death. The numbers were staggering. While the United States produced over 86,000 aircraft in 1943 alone, a figure that would climb even higher the following year, Germany managed barely a quarter of that. The same ratio repeated across every category: tanks, artillery, ammunition, ships, and vehicles. America was manufacturing war as though it were a natural resource, while Germany was consuming itself in the attempt to keep pace. For men like Hauptmann Klaus Richter, who had once witnessed the vast efficiency of Willow Run, the reports filtering into the POW camps in 1944 were confirmation of everything they already knew. The Reich's proud declarations of total war were hollow compared to the unstoppable arithmetic of American logistics. Each B-24, each Liberty ship, each tank rolling out of Detroit, Pittsburgh, or Chicago was another nail in the coffin of the German war effort. The mathematical simplicity of it was terrifying. Where Germany built one, America built 10. Where the Reich mobilized thousands, the United States mobilized millions. It was not simply industrial capacity, it was organization, integration, and the complete mobilization of a continental economy. Even Japan's capture of Asian resources could not offset the avalanche of American production. Behind every soldier on the front line stood a chain of factories, railways, and workers that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In contrast, Germany's supply lines were shrinking, its raw materials dwindling, and its population exhausted. The miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the super-heavy tanks, were impressive feats of engineering, but strategically meaningless in the face of overwhelming quantity. 1,000 rockets could not replace a single factory. 100 Tiger tanks could. The world that emerged from the ruins of 1945 was not merely rebuilt, it was reborn. Across continents, in bombed-out capitals and silent villages, a new rhythm began to pulse, the rhythm of reconstruction. Nowhere was this transformation more profound than in Germany, a nation that had been both architect and victim of industrialized warfare. The very factories that had once produced tanks, aircraft, and artillery now stood empty, their smokestacks cold, their workers displaced. Yet within this desolation lay potential, the raw material for a new beginning. In the ashes of defeat, the German people faced an existential question not of survival, but of purpose. They had seen what power without conscience could build and destroy. They had seen cities flattened by bombs, families torn apart by ideology, and millions buried under the weight of lies. For many, including former Wehrmacht officer Klaus Richter, the challenge was no longer to serve a regime, but to serve humanity itself. The Allied occupation was unlike any victory in history. Instead of erasing Germany, the victors set out to remake it, not in their image, but in the image of democracy. American, British, French, and Soviet forces divided the country, each governing their zone, each shaping the post-war order in their own way. But in the Western zones, something remarkable took root. Under the guidance of American planners, economists, and educators, West Germany was not treated as a conquered land, but as a future partner. The Marshall Plan became the blueprint for this resurrection, pouring unprecedented resources into rebuilding cities, railways, and industries. But more than that, it rebuilt trust, between nations, between former enemies, and between leaders and citizens. For the first time in decades, Germans were being taught that their worth lay not in obedience, but in initiative. That their nation's strength would no longer be measured in weapons, but in ideas. In this crucible of reconstruction, the memory of America's wartime industrial miracle became both inspiration and warning. Richter and countless others who had once stood awestruck in American factories now found themselves in gutted workshops in Bremen, Essen, and Stuttgart, surrounded by the ghosts of machines that had once fueled conquest. Yet, as the Allies delivered steel, coal, and capital, a new kind of machine began to rise, one powered by cooperation instead of domination. German engineers, disciplined and methodical, married their precision to the American model of mass production. The result was a synthesis that would come to define post-war Europe, the social market economy. It was capitalism tempered by responsibility, ambition guided by ethics. For Richter, this was redemption made tangible, to use the same hands that once serviced warplanes to now build peace. He would later write, "We learned that the greatest weapon of all is productivity in service of life." The early years of West Germany's rebirth were marked by both scarcity and spirit. Rubble women, Trümmerfrauen, cleared debris brick by brick, their hands bleeding but their eyes unbroken. Men returned from captivity to find their homes gone but their will intact. And in every town, church bells began to ring again, not for victory, but for survival. The factories came alive once more, Krupp, Daimler-Benz, Siemens, BMW. Yet now, their assembly lines produced cars instead of tanks, radios instead of rifles. Every product was a declaration that Germany's future would be built, not conquered. America's influence lingered in every process, every design philosophy, every management system. The German worker, once chained to ideology, was now empowered by efficiency and rewarded by merit. The old propaganda of racial destiny was replaced by a new creed: quality, innovation, precision. By the early 1950s, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. West Germany's economy, once obliterated, became the driving force of Europe's recovery. The term Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, entered history books, symbolizing not just material wealth, but moral renewal. To Richter and his generation, the lesson of America's wartime superiority had been internalized: industrial power was not about domination, but about direction. When guided by freedom and fairness, production became the most humane of forces. The same logistical genius that once fed an army of destruction now powered an engine of prosperity. Roads that once carried tanks now carried trade. Ships that once delivered bombs now carried goods. The numbers told the story: where the United States had once outproduced Germany 10-1 in war, Germany now sought to match America 1-1 in peace. As the 1950s unfolded, the scars of war began to fade beneath the steel and glass of reconstruction. But memory lingered, not as guilt alone, but as guidance. The same generation that had witnessed the firestorms of Hamburg and Dresden now watched smokestacks rise again, this time carrying not the soot of destruction but the promise of prosperity. The Allies' vision for Germany was not only material, it was moral. They knew that to prevent another catastrophe, they had to rebuild not only cities but souls. And so, in schools, in workplaces, and in homes, a new civic identity took shape. The German people began to see themselves not as victims of defeat, but as participants in renewal. American cultural influence, once derided as foreign, became a model of openness and optimism. Jazz replaced the martial anthems of the past, Coca-Cola and Cadillac symbolized modernity, not corruption. Democracy, for all its imperfections, felt alive. Klaus Richter, now a civilian engineer, often reflected on the paradox of power he had witnessed in America's factories years before. He remembered standing at Willow Run, the B-24 bombers emerging from the line like clockwork, each aircraft a symbol of the relentless efficiency that had crushed Germany's dreams of domination. But in the 1950s, he began to see that same system, the marriage of machinery and freedom, reshaping Europe for peace. In Stuttgart, he worked with American and German engineers on joint industrial projects, learning that cooperation itself was a new form of strength. The Cold War loomed, the Iron Curtain dividing East from West, but in West Germany, the ideology of productivity triumphed over the ideology of fear. Richter and his peers had no interest in armies or borders, they were building something far more enduring, stability. The United States had taught the world an unexpected lesson, that democracy could be engineered, not imposed. In workshops and boardrooms, former soldiers became technocrats, dreamers, builders. The German economy, rebuilt on the principles of competition and fairness, became a pillar of Western resilience. When the Soviet Union boasted of its tanks and rockets, West Germany countered with precision tools, automobiles, and industrial art. Each Mercedes-Benz that rolled off the line was more than a vehicle, it was a testament to a nation's resurrection through design, discipline, and decency. The Marshall Plan had not simply rebuilt factories, it had rewired the German mind. For the older generation, the contrast was haunting. Richter once told a visiting American journalist, in 1943, "I saw your bombers roll out every hour. I thought that was victory. But I see now, victory is when those same factories make machines that feed, clothe, and connect the world." His words captured the heart of the post-war transformation, the recognition that power untempered by morality is ruin, while morality empowered by industry is civilization. And yet, this understanding came at a cost. The shadows of the Holocaust, the memories of complicity, and the awareness of silence weighed heavily on the collective conscience. The new Germany had to confront its past not with denial, but with acknowledgement. Schools taught the truth. Museums preserved the horror. Memorials rose not to glorify, but to warn. The rebuilding of a nation was inseparable from the rebuilding of its soul. The Cold War years tested this fragile new order. The Berlin blockade, the Korean War, the nuclear arms race, all threatened to drag humanity back into madness. But this time, the lesson held. The Western Alliance, powered by economics rather than ideology, resisted through production, trade, and unity. American and German factories, once enemies, now formed the industrial heart of NATO. Aircraft carriers, tanks, and jets still rolled off the lines, but beneath the machinery of defense lay a deeper structure, a network of interdependence that made large-scale war between modern democracies increasingly unthinkable. Where once Hitler had preached domination through force, the post-war West discovered domination through collaboration. By the 1960s, the miracle was visible from space, cities that had been ash fields now glittered with neon and glass. Frankfurt became a financial hub, Hamburg a port of global trade, Munich a center of engineering and innovation. German factories once again led the world, but now in peacetime production. And through it all, Richter's generation, those who had once walked as prisoners, carried the silent conviction that their country's greatest strength was no longer its army, but its industry and ethics. The very concept of power had been rewritten. The industrial supremacy that once symbolized conquest was now a guardian of peace. By the 1970s and 1980s, the transformation of Germany had become undeniable, not merely in economics, but in the spirit of its people. The generation that had once been prisoners, factory workers, and soldiers now walked freely in a world they had helped rebuild. Klaus Richter, now an elder statesman of engineering and civic responsibility, often reflected on the extraordinary journey from 1943, when he had first toured Willow Run, to the modern era, where West German industry not only competed globally but inspired it. The factories he had once seen producing instruments of war now produced automobiles, consumer electronics, and precision machinery that powered the global economy. Each assembly line, each trained hand, each invention bore the echo of the lesson he had learned as a prisoner: production unchained from ideology could be a force for creation instead of destruction. America had shown him the way, Germany had internalized it. The Cold War, for all its tensions, underscored this lesson. West Germany, allied with the United States and NATO, became the economic engine of Europe. Its cities, rebuilt on foundations laid by Marshall Plan assistance, thrived. Railways hummed, ports expanded, and the Rhine once again carried cargo instead of refugees. At the same time, East Germany, trapped behind the Iron Curtain, demonstrated the contrasting fate of a system that prioritized ideology over industrial efficiency and personal freedom. The stark divide across the Berlin Wall, which rose in 1961, was a physical manifestation of the lesson Richter and his contemporaries had absorbed decades earlier: productivity alone is insufficient if it is constrained by oppression. East German factories produced goods, yes, but without the vitality and innovation of free enterprise, their outputs were stifled, their potential wasted. When the wall finally fell in 1989, the world saw more than the reunification of a divided nation. It witnessed the triumph of the principles that had first been revealed in a wartime factory tour in 1943: freedom, innovation, and disciplined production in harmony. Richter often spoke to young engineers and students, recounting his experiences as a POW and his observations of American industry. He described the awe he had felt watching B-24 Liberators roll off the Willow Run assembly line every hour, each bomber a testament to human ingenuity and coordination. He spoke not to glorify war, but to emphasize the power of organization, planning, and ethical labor. We saw, he told audiences decades later, how a single nation, when united in purpose and guided by justice, could reshape the world. That lesson did not end with war. It became the foundation of peace. His words resonated far beyond Germany, influencing business leaders, policymakers, and educators who recognized that industrial capacity, when paired with moral accountability, could drive progress without conquest. The late 20th century confirmed the enduring relevance of this realization. Germany emerged not only as a European leader but as a global exemplar of reconciliation and productivity. Former adversaries became trading partners, cities once bombed into oblivion became hubs of commerce, technology, and culture. The lessons from Willow Run, the mathematical inevitability of American industrial supremacy, the moral clarity of democratic production, and the practical demonstration of freedom as a force multiplier, became the template for Germany's reconstruction and Europe's integration. When NATO expanded, when the European Union took shape, when Germany assumed responsibility for global economic leadership, the ghosts of 1943 were never far from memory. The men who had witnessed defeat and abundance firsthand understood that the true power of a nation lay not in its armies, but in its ability to organize, innovate, and uphold principles that foster life rather than destruction. As the 21st century arrived, the legacy of that era continued to echo. Germany's industrial model, informed by the lessons of both destruction and rebirth, became a cornerstone of the modern global economy. Automotive engineers, aircraft designers, and technology innovators carried forward the principles first glimpsed by Richter: precision, efficiency, and ethical responsibility. Even as new challenges arose, climate change, digital revolutions, geopolitical tensions, the understanding remained that human ingenuity, when paired with moral vision, was the ultimate force in shaping history. The story of Klaus Richter and his fellow POWs stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of insight. By witnessing both devastation and abundance, they understood that defeat need not lead to despair. It could, if harnessed correctly, inspire an entire generation to rebuild, innovate, and create a future far greater than what had been lost. In the end, the narrative of Germany's defeat and revival is inseparable from the broader history of industrial warfare and the moral awakening it prompted. From the factory floors of Detroit to the ruined cities of the Rhineland, from the assembly lines of the Allies to the reconstruction workshops of Europe, the story is one of cause and consequence, failure and renewal. It is a narrative that reveals the profound truth of the 20th century: that a nation's fate is determined not only by weapons or ideology, but by its capacity to produce, sustain, and uplift life. Germany's transformation, catalyzed by the very industrial prowess that had once crushed it, became a blueprint for democracy, innovation, and global cooperation. The men who had once walked through Willow Run as captives now walked freely in a reborn Germany, carrying with them the immutable lesson that the true machinery of victory is the union of knowledge, productivity, and conscience.